So we talked about the ventricular system, this very intricate system of cavities inside your brain. In this video, we're going to talk about other structures inside of your brain. When I was younger, I'd see a picture of a brain, on the outside, and you see it's kind of jelly-like, has all those grooves, and I thought that's what it looked like all the way through. And it wasn't until like an embarrassingly late moment in my life where I realized if you dissected the brain, then you realize how intricate and how many structures are actually inside the brain. Yeah, it's very, very complicated. And we're just going to talk about some of those structures today. We're only going to talk about 3 of them. So hopefully it's not that bad. We're going to talk about the hypothalamus. We're going to talk about the thalamus. And we're going to talk about the limbic system. Just these 3 for the sake of this video. Now your hypothalamus, if you weren't sleeping during the endocrine block, you know the hypothalamus is incredibly important for regulating your hormones, your anterior pituitary, your posterior pituitary, and those make up the majority of the hormones we need for homeostasis. So you know that is needed for hormones. I'm not going to reiterate that. But you should also know that the hypothalamus is incredibly important for desire. These primal urges that we all have. Before we talk about that, I just want to describe what the hypothalamus looks like. So your hypothalamus, if we're looking at the brain like this, so if we're looking at the brain like this, inside your brain, you have a structure called the hypothalamus. Let's just blow that up and make it larger. So it'll look like this. And there'll be a anterior end. So anterior. And of course, if there's an anterior end, there's a posterior end. All right, posterior. And the side that's more towards, I guess, your hemisphere, you're split in the hemisphere, it's going to be your medial side. So, all right, medial. And then the side that's facing on the outside is going to be your lateral side. So lateral. Hopefully that's not too complicated. And then you have this little nugget that sits right above the optic chiasm. Right above it, so we call it the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So it sits above the chiasm, suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that's the structure of your hypothalamus, kind of crudely, but that's very simple, easy to understand. So I say your hypothalamus has a lot to do with desire. The way I remember the type of desires we're talking about is I think of someone that's stranded in the desert. All right, so it's a Mad Max situation. So you're stranded in the desert and the sun's beating down on you. And you're sweating, you're dying of heat. So you just have this overwhelming desire. You don't even have to think about it. You got to find shade, right? You got to get out of the heat. So things like temperature regulation. And then after you've gotten out of the heat and you're resting, you're cool, now you're hungry, now you're thirsty, you gotta get some substance. You're gonna starve to death in the desert if you don't. So, hunger, thirst. And lucky you see this village kind of on the outskirts of the desert, so you stumble your way into the village and they take pity on you and they give you all this food and give you all this water and you're full again. Yeah! So you have a belly full of food, you're no longer thirsty, and you want to sleep. That's just a primitive desire. We don't have to actively think, oh, now we have to sleep now. Sleep for 8 hours, wake up now. So you just have that primitive desire to sleep now. All right, so you're happy, healthy, content, and you want to go to sleep. And then there's one more desire, sexual desire, which I'm not going to hack that for you. So we're not going to talk about that in this video. But these are your main desires, and surprise, surprise, your hypothalamus is going to control that. We'll talk about temperature regulation first. Temperature regulation is going to be your anterior, posterior. So your anterior hypothalamus is going to deal with cooling. And this is going to be mainly parasympathetic activity. So it helps you cool down. And the way I like to remember, and it's on first aid too, is anterior and cooling. Sounds like AC or air conditioning. That's the easy way to remember anterior deals with cooling. Now what happens if you destroy your anterior hypothalamus and you can no longer cool yourself? Yeah, your body can no longer cool itself. And so you're just always hyperthermic. So, all right, destruction equals hyperthermic. Hyperthermic. That's cooling. What about heating? Very glad you mentioned that. So your posterior is going to be your heating. Posterior heating. And this is going to be sympathetic activity. That makes sense. If you just have too much sympathetic activity, don't you get hot, don't you sweat, don't you feel that? So sympathetic activity. If you ever swam in really cold water and you got out and you start shivering, that's your body, that's your posterior hypothalamus trying to warm yourself. You shiver to warm yourself. I'm not gonna write that down. I was gonna write shiver, but you just kind of know, okay? So your body has different mechanisms of ways to warm itself. What happens if you destroy this posterior hypothalamus? Then you can no longer warm yourself. So you're constantly cold. We call this piccolo-thermic. Basically means cold-blooded. P for piccolo-thermic, P for posterior. You can no longer warm yourself. So all right, cold-blooded. So done with temperature regulation. You got out, found some shade, and now you're hungry. And lucky for us, in our story, we had a village, so you run to the village and you able to eat, able to drink. So things that regulate hunger and thirst are gonna be your medial and your lateral. So your lateral deals with the thirst and the hunger. Now it's controlled by hormones, mainly ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. So when you're hungry, you make ghrelin and you want to eat. And then when you've eaten enough, your adipocytes, your fat tissue, will make a counter-regulatory hormone called leptin. Leptin deals with satiety. It says, I am full, I am stuffed, I don't want to eat anymore. And so this will inhibit your lateral hypothalamus. It says, I'm no longer hungry, I'm no longer thirsty, I am full. What happens if you destroy your lateral hypothalamus? Well, you'll no longer have the desire to eat, the desire to drink, so you'll become anorexic. Failure to thrive. You just don't have the desire. You can just spend all day without being hungry, being thirsty. So lateral deals with hunger, deals with thirst. What about your medial? Your medial deals with satiety. We already kind of talked about satiety. What's the main hormone that regulates satiety? It'd be your leptin. Leptin. What happens if you destroy your medial hypothalamus? Then you no longer reach satiety, and so you're always hungry. Yeah. So you're going to be always hungry. Always hungry. All right, destruction equals always hungry. All right, done with hunger and thirst. We said you went to the village, you ate, you have a belly full of food, you're no longer hungry, you're no longer thirsty. Now you want to sleep. Sleep. And that deals with our last structure, your suprachiasmatic nucleus. Your suprachiasmatic nucleus regulates your circadian rhythm. Circadian, that is your sleep rhythm. And it gets a lot of inputs from a lot of places, especially your eye, your retina. So if you see that it's bright out, that it's light out, you're not going to be sleepy. But when you see it's nighttime, it's dark, then you will get sleepy. So it gets a lot of input from your eye and from light. That's why they recommend you don't use too much bright lights when you're about to sleep. Otherwise, it can mess up your sleep rhythm. And that is your hypothalamus. That wasn't too bad, hopefully. Let's talk about your thalamus. Your thalamus is the master relay switch. It takes all sensation and input and sends it where it needs to go. So here's your brain. Here's your thalamus. It takes all the sensation that you feel on a daily basis and kind of says, okay, where does it need to go? Does it need to go to your motor cortex or your sensory cortex or your occipital lobe or your temporal lobe, etc., etc. So it's a master relay. Master relay for everything except your olfactory, your smelling. Your olfactory nerve goes straight to your brain. Yeah, it doesn't need a relay. But everything else, it'll process it, then sends it where it needs to go. So that's your master relay. Let's talk about the structure of your thalamus. So if we're looking at the brain from this angle, so you have your brain, you have your thalamus here. This is not to proportion, okay? So there's your thalamus. you have your anterior part. No problems there. You have your posterior part, but this time we call the posterior part your pulvinar part. Pulvinar part. Pulvinar means cushion. I don't know why they call it that instead of posterior, but they call it pulvinar. Right in the middle, you have this little nugget called your medial geniculate. Geniculate means at a sharp angle, and this little nugget kind of comes off at a sharp angle. So medial geniculate, and then you have another geniculate on the side. Because it's on the side, we'll call it a lateral geniculate. Lateral geniculate. You have an underside of your thalamus. The underside we call ventral. So you have your ventral. So that would mean you have an upper side. That would be your dorsal. Now the dorsal is not very complicated, but your ventral is incredibly complicated. It's separated into a lot of different sections. All right, so it can get very complicated. For example, here, because it's more in the midline of your hemispheres, this would be called your ventral medial. Here, because it's more on the lateral end, we'll call it your ventrolateral. We can even break it up into here. This would be your ventral posterior medial. So it's still midline, but it's a little bit further back. So ventral posterior medial, or VPM. This angle is somewhat difficult, so we're going to look at it at a different angle. Instead of looking at it from the side, we're going to look at it from top down. So we're going to draw it like this. Here will be your anterior end. Anterior. Here will be your pulvinar. Pulvinar. So this was medial geniculate. Lateral geniculate. This will be your ventral side. Ventral. This will be your ventral lateral. This will be your ventral posterior lateral. So this will be your ventral posterior medial. And if this is your ventral side, this must be your dorsal side. All right, so this is your thalamus. The reason it's so complicated is because it needs to take in all those different sensations, process it, send it where it needs to go. So we need it to be complicated. So we're going to talk about what all these structures do. We're going to break it into input, what's being sent to the thalamus, what is it processing, and then output. After it's done processing, what part of your brain does your thalamus send that information? So input and output. We'll start with, what should we start with? We'll start with the lateral geniculate. Your lateral geniculate has to deal with vision. So the input is going to be vision, which is your cranial nerve 2. Where will it send that information? Well, what part of your brain deals with vision? It will be your occipital lobe. So it sends it to your occipital lobe. They might ask you where in particular in your occipital lobe. There's this little groove, this sulcus, called your calcarine sulcus. All right, and that's just part of your occipital lobe. If we draw our brain out, we had our frontal, parietal, temporal, then our occipital lobe. Well, this little sulcus would be right here. So your thalamus will send it to that sulcus. Okay? That's your lateral geniculate. How about your medial geniculate? Your medial geniculate deals with hearing or auditory. Now, auditory isn't just cranial nerve 8. It also has a lot to do with your brainstem, and in particular in your midbrain you have something called superior olive and inferior colliculus. So this is all the things that input into your medial geniculate. If you think hearing is just cranial nerve 8, you're wrong. There's so much more to hearing than just cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 8 will transmit sound to your brain, but we use our hearing for so much more than just sound. I mean, we use it for protection. We have a startle reflex. If there's a gunshot, we'll transmit that sound, that's cranial nerve 8, but we'll process it, know something is wrong, then we'll run or we'll bolt. So there's so much more. I mean, this also has to deal with making sure our ears are okay. Are the sounds equal on both sides? Is there a pause between one ear? So there's so much more that goes on in our hearing than just cranial nerve 8. And superior olive and inferior colliculus plays a role in that. All right, that's the input. Where, after it's been processed, does it go? Where's the output? Well, what part of your brain deals with sound? That'd be your temporal lobe. So output is temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. Let's move on to ventral lateral. Ventral lateral deals with motor, all your motor input. All right, motor. So input, everything. Basal ganglia, cerebellum. What do you think the output is after it's been processed? We'll go to your motor cortex. So motor cortex. And then the last two is going to be your ventral posterior lateral, ventral posterior medial. We'll start with VPM. VPM deals with the sensation on your face, so all right, face. And then also taste, face and taste, face and taste. So face is going to be your trigeminal nerve. All right, face, trigeminal. Taste. Now taste is very complicated. We haven't talked to cranial nerves in detail yet. We kind of just referenced it, but there are many different cranial nerves that deal with taste. So for now, we're just going to call this gustatory sensation. That's an easy cop out for us for now, okay? So just know VPM deals with face and taste. I just love saying face and taste. That's the input. After it's been processed, where does it go? Where's the output? It'll be your sensory cortex. Every parietal lobe. And then it senses what's touching my face or what am I tasting. Sensory cortex. That's VPM. VPL covers everything that's been left out. Basically, all the sensation that you feel from your spinal cord. Pain, temp, proprioception. I mean, the list goes on. So I'll write them all out. Pain, temp, touch, proprioception, vibration, everything. What's this input is going to be your spinal cord fibers. Now, we're going to talk about the spinal cord at the end of this block, but you have two types of fibers. You have one that sends sensation to your brain. We call that spine, to your thalamus, spinal thalamic tract. And then once you process that in your brain, you'll send signals back, tell you what to do. But because we're talking about input, we're talking about sensation going to your thalamus, so we're going to be talking about those spinal thalamic tracts. So these are your ascending spinal thalamic tracts. Spinal thalamic tracts. That's your input. What's your output? It will be your sensory cortex. Sensory cortex. And that is your thalamus. Hope that wasn't too bad. Just a few different structures that you kind of need to know. What they process, where they send it to. If it helps you, draw it out just like I did. That way it's not so abstract. You can kind of visualize it. That is your thalamus. The last thing is your limbic system. Your limbic system is kind of like your hypothalamus. It deals with desire. Desire. It's usually inhibited by your frontal cortex, your executive function, where it says it's not an appropriate time to do that or say that. So I'll just write inhibited by frontal lobe. So it has a lot to do with desire for drive. It also plays a part in memory. Okay, so your limbic system is made up of almost half a dozen different structures, and we just group them all together and call it the limbic system. All right, so if you see a structure that I haven't mentioned before, then it's probably in the limbic system. That's an easy way to remember. But if you want to know the particular structures and what they're associated with, then we can talk about it. Things like your hippocampus, things like your mammillary bodies. These seem to be associated with memory. If your hippocampus gets knocked out, then you have memory loss. If your mammillary bodies get knocked out, then you have memory loss. You usually, when we talk about mammillary body atrophy, we're talking about Wernicke's and corsica. Don't they have memory loss? Yeah. So these deal with memory. You can also have things like amygdala. Amygdala deals with emotion and it deals with a lot of this desire. You can have an infection of your amygdala, especially in HSV1. We talked about HSV1 when we talked about infections, when we say it causes seizures, and we say it like to penetrate deep and affect your temporal lobe. Well, it can penetrate and affect your amygdala. And when you have an infection of your amygdala or inflammation of your amygdala, then you really express these desires. They're no longer inhibited by your frontal lobe. So it comes off as disinhibition. Sometimes characterized by hyperorality. That means you say whatever you want to say. Hyperphagia, you eat whatever you want to eat. And hypersexuality, you literally do what you want to do. So all those show up as disinhibition. So that is either inflammation or some sort of lesion on your amygdala. So these are your internal structures of your brain. Hopefully that cleared things up, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.